better never ends. In health, in performance, no matter your starting point, you can always strive for better. My name's Charlie Goodchild, I'm your host, and this is the Better Never Ends podcast. We've made it our mission to share with you the expertise and wisdom of role models and leading experts in their field, teaching us about how we can be better, telling stories about their journey to better, and inspiring you to discover yours.
A very warm welcome today to Dr. Pauline Chiarizia, a counselling psychologist who works in private practice here in central London. And Pauline works alongside me in the Until space that we're in today. And we have only known each other a very short time, and I overheard you talking actually in the, let's call it the staff room upstairs, like the clubhouse area. And your conversations with just everyone just seems so diverse, so interesting, and so thoughtful. And I'm a sucker for that kind of stuff. I love talking about the brain, psychology, and just thinking about thinking, actually. I really enjoy that. So I'm very pleased to have you in today, very excited to talk about this stuff. And you specialize in anxiety, in burnout, and I'm really keen to get your thoughts on trauma as well and how that can impact on our lives as adults. So I'll bring you into the conversation now, Pauline. Please tell us a bit about who you are, how you came to be counselling psychologist, and then we'll work our way through the conversation from there.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's so nice to be able to have a space to talk about this kind of topic, especially with trauma, because it's very needed and it's a big topic that involves a lot of nuances. So I'm very, very grateful to be here to be able to do that. And yeah, so my background in terms of wanting to become a counseling psychologist wasn't straightforward. Actually, I've always known that I wanted to become a psychologist, but I always struggled to pick between clinical and counseling. And the choice that I made to go into counseling really stems from my own personal developments. And the reason why I love the counseling ethos is because it's really deeply rooted in social justice and the relational aspects of things, which is so important when it comes to trauma. So it just fits more in terms of how I identify as a person. So then I feel like when I'm working, I am bringing a part of me as well in the work. So yeah. Well,
we know that having a purpose and a sense of meaning is very powerful in our own career satisfaction, right? So, right from the beginning, it sounds like you've picked up on that, and I'm not sure everyone lands on that that concept until it's too late, actually. So it's quite, well, we hadn't planned to talk about this at all, but actually that's quite an important thing when you're choosing your career. And I think it's perfectly fine for people to be exploring in the early stage of their career. But if you can find meaning and purpose in something, I mean, it's well worth pursuing, right? You're much more likely to find some happiness and satisfaction with your job as a result.
Absolutely. And it also makes it easier to hold the big things, the difficult part of the jobs sometimes as well. So you can always hold on to that sense of purpose, and that the fact that it fits with who I am, it makes it easier for me to show up for my clients also, right?
Could you just clarify the difference then? So you mentioned a bit about what the counseling part of it would mean. What does a clinical psychologist do? What's the difference?
If you think about it, so if you were to look on Google, right, clinical psychologist or counseling psychologist and look at the jobs, okay, so now we do the same jobs, we work in the same environments, same salaries, but historically speaking, there is a difference. So it's the history that is different, and then the way the training is. So historically speaking, clinical psychologists were the ones working in hospitals and working with more severe pathologies. So psychosis, schizophrenia, you name it, personality disorders. Whereas counseling psychologists were working more with things like stress management, relationships, things like that, and outside of a clinical, as in hospital environments. But counseling psychologist stems from the United States. Right. And I mean, counseling psychologist rings with Carl Rogers. That's basically the grandfather of it. And it's the ethos truly is unconditional love for yourself and for others, and the relational part. So we are relational beings, and that no one is above anyone else. So that's the beauty of it. So the way that I work, so if I see, now, of course, we work together, right? And there are certain, we even in terms of choices of therapies, right? In terms of therapeutic modalities, Counseling and clinical totally have similar ways of working. It's now a personal choice of choosing to develop skills in one type or another, right? But one will be more quick to look at the person associated to their system, and one is more looking at their symptoms and severity of that, and then look at it in a systemic way.
Yeah, if I look at my world of rehabilitation, we're looking at pathology or injury, and I guess that's the clinical part. But
so this is similar, exactly. Yeah. But I don't also want to just because clinical psychologists also see you as a human being. So I wanted to right. Yeah, so it doesn't mean that it's not like we're not against pathologies, right? But it's just historically speaking, and it's coming from different therapies, right? Clinical, a lot of it is leaning on the cognitive behavioral types of therapies, whereas counseling is more humanities, like person-centered therapy is the first one that you learn. So it's just style also, and the way you just understand someone and their pain. But in terms of goals, we all want to have improvements and people to have a better sense of themselves and their lives. It's just the way that you would approach it is different. This is it. And then in history, it's just a different history attached to it. Good. Yeah.
Well, the good news is that we are talking about this today, and that society is talking about this more often, and there are some positives attached to that, more chance for conversation. Yes. There are also some negatives that can come through that. People have better access to the terminology, and that can sometimes lead to some unhelpful change and some unhelpful labeling. So can you just give us some kind of your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And I feel like this is, and we're all struggling with this, whether you are a counseling psychologist like me or a clinical or, counselor, psychotherapist, we all have to now have conversations about this. How do you understand the diagnosis? Because that's what this is, right? Like the diagnoses that are out there on social media. And a lot of people don't understand that this is not something that we assess quickly. Also, this is something that you take your time to look at. We also consult with other professionals. Psychologists have supervision. So you never just look at a few symptoms and say, this is what this is. But online, it's hard. And I get it. I find it difficult to make my own mental health content. You just don't have the space for nuance, right? And people also really like certainty. So there's something comforting about, look, this is the list and this is where I fit in. And like, now I can name what I'm going through, because it is incredibly destabilizing when you're not well and you don't have the words for it. That's really, really painful. So I totally understand where this is coming from. But unfortunately, sometimes it leads to people to think that they have something that they don't have. Yeah. And if you're lucky enough, you go to your doctor, you make an appointment, and then you get to the root cause of what's going on. But some people are so not stubborn, maybe that's not the right way of putting it, but they're holding on so hard to that label. There's something about the label. It's like, no, I have PTSD, for example. That's a very reoccurring one. And it's almost like if I don't fit this, then my pain is invalidated. So then it's difficult to build the relationship with clinicians who are saying, no, you don't fit it. But it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. You can still come and see me. You still get care. It doesn't mean, but unless they have a clinician that says, no, I agree, you have that label, and kind of goes with what they want to hear, they're not accessing care. Yeah. And this is not something you can control. So it's hard because it brings more awareness. So more people talk about mental health, which is great. But the downside is this, which is complex to manage.
So the label is becoming a crutch that they lean on rather than a vehicle in order to help them work on the process of recovery, which it can take time, can take energy, it can take effort. So that's the stuff clinicians are often helpful, coaches are often helpful, counselors, whatever it might be, in whichever discipline we're talking here. And this aligns with, I heard a podcast with James Hollis on the Huberman Lab podcast recently, and he said you can't make a diagnosis without in-depth, detailed conversation.
Absolutely,
and that is absent from online engagement. It is just purely transactional and very quick and very list-oriented. So that was a fascinating thing. And I thought when I'm having really my consultations with people, it's long, drawn out over several consultations often. And even then I might sit on the fence with a diagnosis because I'm not quite ready, because I want to hear more, I want to try more things and test whether this theory plays out. So it's a provisional diagnosis and we work on it, and it often changes.
And sometimes it's even a question of, do you need the diagnosis? What is it actually for? Which is very uncomfortable for some people to hear. And, it doesn't mean I'm against that diagnosis at all, but I understand as diagnoses are helpful for me to send an invoice to an insurance, for example. And this is another debate, okay? Some clinicians are not happy with that because you have to fit a person in a box, right? And sometimes the diagnosis available, they're not really representing what the problem, right? So that's one thing. But something else that happens is it's good for me to use it if I want to talk with other doctors, because diagnosis means it's a label. I know what that label means. So what kind of symptoms we're talking about. So it helps to shape treatment plans, right? And to have just shared language with doctors. But do you need that? Because your pain, it doesn't matter what label you have. You experience it in your body the same way. That is what I care so much more than the label. So let's get into your experience of your pain, the experiences of your symptoms. So that's very important. If I link it back to trauma, that's even more important, because usually you have that disconnect with your body. So some people, they're kind of coping through their traumas by looking for an outside name. So you keep being focused on the outside world instead of sitting with what's intolerable within. And that usually is the therapeutic work, is to dive within so we can finally look at it. So it's when you think about it like that, it's quite interesting, because I sometimes wonder, is it about the label, or is this you coping? Is this you being in pain?
How do we decide what trauma is relevant for this conversation here? So everyone could look back in their history and think of a traumatic experience.
Yes.
How do we decide what's truly trauma in the context of what we're saying here?
So for me, honestly, it really has to do with a disconnection. So it would have to be going back. So let's say we're talking about specific trauma. Someone is answering to you saying, okay, what about this, right? This happened to me. How can I know that this is having still an impact on me? Yes or no? My first instinct would be to look at how did you understand the trauma? So it's not necessarily what happened, is your relationship to it. So if we take the context of sexual abuse, a lot of victims of that think it's their fault. So if you carry that, it shapes the way you relate to yourself. Instead of, no, someone else did that to me, and this says more about who they are. It has nothing to do about my body, my clothes, or who I am at all. Then it changes the way that you continue your life. That event was painful, don't get me wrong, but it's not having an impact on how you identify as a person. So it's not having an impact on your decisions, on how you kind of move around in the world and how you relate to other people. But usually with trauma, you internalize it in some way. It's having an impact on your sense of self, your self-esteem, your identity, and you now have a new kind of lens on your eyes, and you see the world in a very different way. Other people are unsafe. The world is dangerous. We're seeing things more, I call it tunnel vision. When you start to lose nuance and everything looks just one type of way, it's possible that there's a trauma underneath. Yeah. And you're just replicating that. You're continuing to seeing things through that lens because you haven't processed that pain. So it's still here.
So the person starts to to identify as...
It changes you as a person. This is it. And there's also an element of disconnection with your body. Because if you need to change the way you perceive the world and to survive through the pain that you've gone through and you change yourself. And this is how you adapt. From childhood, if we talk about childhood trauma, children do this all the time, especially if there's abuse in the household. Children, it's so painful for a child to recognize that, oh, mom and dad who love me, or two mothers or two fathers who love me, also hurt me. Like that, there's no way a child's brain can conceive that. It's way too painful. So a good way of understanding that is if mom or dad do something to me that's painful, it means I did something bad. So you see, that's then the trauma, right? Because then you carry with your life thinking this about yourself. Sometimes other people do wrong or hurt me in a certain way. And yeah, it's probably because I kind of deserve it. And if you look at that, it's like, no, of course you don't. But you internalize it like that. Because no child is strong enough to say, you hurt me, this is all right. Or to pick up the phone and call the police. There's no 5-year-old that does that.
Their world is smaller as well, right? So
yes,
because their world is smaller, they have less options for external
How do you survive?
labeling.
How do you survive? You also don't have the names for it.
Yeah.
And also your relationship with your body is so different at that age. You don't understand it so well. We're also not teaching children. Well, now maybe it's a little bit different, hopefully. But, for a lot of generations, it wasn't taught that emotions are in the body. So children would be doing, living their lives, but they don't pick up necessarily on their physiological cues that I'm not feeling comfortable, right? So it's complicated, but it really, you have to really look at like, how did the person understand their trauma? How has it impacted about how they now, when they look in the mirror, who do they see? And are they making choices based by fear? This is also another element. Yeah.
And is there a pattern associated with childhood trauma that then plays out into adulthood that you would recognize?
So, one thing is like continuing being in situations and also in relationships that don't fit your needs at all. And by that, I say, severe kind of people pleasing is one. And unfortunately, kind of collecting more abusive relationships because you are being taught that love coexists with abuse. As that's what a child understands. Of course it doesn't, but children, this is what they understand, right? So you unfortunately keep on being then in dynamics where, if you don't feel like you're a good person, you're not necessarily going to go with people who treat you well. This is the norm. So your brain doesn't go with what makes you feel happy. It goes with what makes you feel like, okay, this is safe because I recognize it, not because it's actually emotionally safe. So if you don't know what emotional safety is, if there's been physical abuse, if there's been sexual abuse, what is even safety? You don't even know it. Your body is in this state of hypervigilance the whole time. So that's what you will be linked to when you grow up, which is really painful because you obviously don't want that. And it's hard to hear. Because a lot of people think, well, no way I'm going to ever experience this later on, okay? It's not like people do this on purpose. But unfortunately, it is a pattern. Or people that make decisions, they think they want the things that they want, but they don't necessarily. They're following a script. And it's very extreme kind of lifestyle. A lot of adrenaline, always busy, always doing something. Like the second we sit still, it's very uncomfortable.
So a lot of I'm sensing that these choices are often autopilot choices. Yeah. So they're not consciously thinking about this, but they end up making these bad choices throughout any real conscious decision making, and then they find themselves in a situation that that's difficult to come out of. So how if a person is in a situation like that and you're having a conversation and it dates back to a childhood trauma and they're replaying that same process over and over in their adult life, how do you get some sense of change or a realization, a moment from that person?
So it depends where we're at in the process. Obviously, if this is something that I pick up on in the first session, I'm not going to dive right in because I need the safety. I need to build that therapeutic safety with you. So one conversation I would have actually is what is safety for you? So I would almost kind of pause that and say, okay, how are you feeling here? Just sitting here with me. Do you feel safe? What is safety? It's difficult to even describe that if you've gone through a lot of abuse and you're just being hyper vigilant the whole time, because it's almost like your body has been, something happens, adrenaline shoots up, you're in survival mode, but it never comes down to baseline. So it's exhausting. And it's why a lot of people then end up with chronic diseases, because you're constantly stressed and your immune system doesn't like that. But so you kind of tap into safety first. The second thing you look into is their relationship with their bodies, because everything is stored in here. So to bring some awareness that this is what's unfolding, you need to tap into, like, you've been running away from something. What is that? So there's lots of techniques to do this, and people they go through this process at their own pace. Okay. For some people it's quicker. Other people it can take years, because I know we talk a lot about trauma and therapy, and it's, beautiful and do the healing. But if you really look at what it takes to do that, it's very hard. Just to learn safety in your own body when you've always been detached from it, and something's been so painful that you've had to literally cut yourself off from who you are from within, and your just your internal world. It's such a delicate thing. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is, what is the belief, right? What is it? What is the drive? Like I'm not good enough. I didn't deserve better. What is it? Abandonment, rejection. How did your identity got shaped by this? And then you try to change that. All right. So the way that you relate to yourself. So then the trauma still happens and it still hurts, but it's no longer defining you. Now you're like, okay, I can make new choices. You can sense when it's coming back up, and you're like, okay, you can pause. You're so much more in control in your responses. You're making sure it's coming from a place of, do I want this? Yes or no? Or is it automatic, right? So you're just learning how to, and you take your time with this, knowing also that it's trial and error, because the things you didn't experiment with as a kid, you have to do them now, like 20 years later for some people, or even longer after. So it's also giving yourself the patience and the grace that you're experimenting with who you are. And sometimes you just don't know, and it's fine. Just try. Okay. But the goal is to make sure it's not on automatic pilot, and that if you make a mistake, that it's okay, because you can always just choose differently afterwards. But you have to give it a go the first time around, which is scary, but this is why we're here. Yeah.
If it was easy, we'd all be fine, right? Yeah,
no, exactly. So this is, and I really want to stress on that, because I know a lot of people are even now kind of pointing fingers a little bit, like, oh, you're not doing the work. It's like, it's difficult. It's so much more complex than you realize. No one is, again, we're all equals in this. In terms of that, no one is better, no one is doing the better healing. People need to find what works for them, and they need to take their times, and everyone has different circumstances, and so also different privileges, because this access to care is still a problem. Exactly.
Yeah, this is why we do this, because I want to be able to give out some of our knowledge for free and have it accessible. But even this on its own is only going to be a gateway. It's not going to be an entire process for someone to go through. So it's important to make it clear that these things can take time, and it's not going to be easy for anyone, let alone people who don't have the financial ability to work with someone to help go through that process. So I think that's an important thing to raise. And I think what I pick up a lot actually is how much you talk about the body.
Yes.
You talk a lot about, as a psychologist, which is traditionally of the mind, you've spoken a lot about the body and how that that is a connection. Mind-body connection is absolutely a scientific fact. We don't need to dispute that anymore. That is a fact. But for many people, they do see it as separate entities. Mm-hmm. And what I very, very aware of in my profession is how much the brain is in charge of pain, and how much the brain is in charge of how we feel in our bodies. And I love that you're talking about that too. One of those influences is going to be the fight and flight response, always being on and switched on and ready for threat and danger. And because ultimately the brain and the system is there to protect us. So tell us a bit more detail about how you perceive the link between the mind and the body, and how that impacts on people's sense of safety and their sense of calm.
I think it's everything. It's also, at least hopefully this will change, but if you think about when you're little and your tummy hurts, we teach children that, okay, there's a process. There's a very linear process. A tummy hurts, therefore something is wrong with the body. We don't even teach children that it could stem from an emotional cue, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then you tell someone. So if you're at school, you tell whoever is there, right? If you're home, you tell a parent or a babysitter, but you tell someone. Then that person brings you to a specific place where there's a doctor. They give you, it gives the pain a name. And then we've got a very straightforward treatment plan. And usually it involves drugs. So it teaches from a very young age that we don't talk about the relationship of the mind and the body. It's two separate things, but actually, and this is why it can get really difficult for certain people later down in life when they're not well and their body is acting out. And of course they go to the doctor, and I'm not saying you should always go see your primary physician if something happens in your body, but the frustration when you don't get a clear answer, or when the doctor says you need to see a psychologist, you're anxious, this is stress. So I had this very interesting conversation with someone not too long ago, and they were arguing, oh, well, it's just stress. And I said, for you, this is how you are talking about it. But for your body, it's thinking, I'm dying, I'm in danger. You're not. So one is very like aloof, like, oh, this is just stress. So I'll be fine. But internally, what's happening is your body thinks it's potentially in danger and may die. It's not at all the same thing. So it's about understanding what's happening in your body, understanding also what this fight, flight, freeze response is, and having a lot of compassion for it, because a lot of people treat their bodies like this is inconvenient. And I get it. You feel anxious. You're not feeling great when you're in that state, right? But it's coming from a place of, I want to protect you, not from, I want to harm you. So if you keep being frustrated about the fact that you're in that state, you're adding another layer of stress to it. Whereas if you think, okay, I think for some reason that I'm in danger, if you're not really aware of why that is, you don't even need to know that. You can think, okay, how can I soothe myself? How can I tell my body that actually I am safe? And then you kind of go back to what I was saying. You go back to, well, what makes me feel safe? But a lot of people don't know the answer to this question. And we haven't really, there's no awareness about that, and not at least when we grow up. So it's hard.
We live a lifestyle as well, which is very stimulating.
It's too stimulating. Yeah.
And as a result, that safety seems further and further away, I guess, without people necessarily knowing that. But that sense of calm and safety is quite abstract for someone who's just been living in a fast-paced, stimulated world for their entire life.
Exactly. And then it also ties into, when you don't know what makes you feel safe, how do you then feel safe with other people?
And what does safety even feel like for that person? This could be abstract again.
But it also means, how do you make someone else feel safe? Also. And this is very important in relationships, because if you don't know what the other person needs to feel safe, if you don't know what you need for that, then, everyone has something. So disagreements will happen. But this is when you get defense against defense. That's exactly what's happening. So ideally, when someone is kind of flaring up, let's say, okay, because something is happening for them and they're having a strong reaction, ideally the other person can recognize that and they can provide safety. And then you can have the difficult conversations, because then the other person realizes I am safe. We still disagree, but I'm safe with you. I'm allowed to disagree. You're not attacking me as a person. So even in terms of understanding what it means to feel safe in your body, it then has a huge impact on how you are with other people. And that is everything, because we are relational beings.
There's this old school mentality of the biomedical approach, isn't there? Which we've talked about, how we think that there's a physical cause to everything or a biological cause to everything. And as a result, we'll use a medical approach to solve that problem. So it's quite an old-fashioned term. Then you have the biopsychosocial model, which there's still a lot of value within thinking that way. But even most people interpreting that would still say big bio, medium psycho, and tiny social.
This is it. It's about,
And what you're talking about there is flipping it and saying the relational social part actually is huge, and that impacts on your psychology, and therefore that can influence your biology. Almost the other way around, social psycho bio model.
Almost,
in a way. So I'm interested by that, because the biology is very easy to diagnose through tests and blood tests and this and that, but actually the other stuff's really difficult to prove in a way, and therefore hard to test in studies, and therefore hard to add control RCTs and
it is
different
hard.
trials, and as it becomes a conversation rather than people being able to say, here I have proof, So how do we cover that? I guess the conversation is about that. But how do we get around the difficulty in people truly buying into it? Because society's getting there, but how do we help people with that?
I get that. Conversation.
Hey.
And even in terms of research methods, conversation. So more studies being mixed methods, more qualitative research as well, to get a more holistic view, right? Because like not everything fits in the RCT.
Yeah.
Also, it's just, you also have too many variables. You have to also think about different contexts, different groups, different communities, all of that, individual differences, that also matters. But it really is tied to people's experiences. So we all have a nervous system. It all works the same way, right? I mean, hopefully it works that way, right? Properly. So it's not about that. It's about your subjective experiences. You can have 5 people in a room with the same diagnosis, the same symptoms, but the way they experience that pain in their bodies and the story that they attach to that is completely different.
So if someone has fundamentally the same nervous system, they have in extremely similar genetic codes,
I hear you.
Why do some people who go through such trauma have no symptoms and move on to live a very normal, in inverted commas, life and very successful and don't carry the baggage of that trauma? Whereas some people who might have potentially a very different traumatic experience in childhood, maybe generally to be considered less severe and yet have incredible lifelong problems.
Yeah. I would say it's environment and support. So this is very, very common. But the question is, who did you tell? Who was there for you? If you're alone in it, then it's very likely that this is trauma for you. But if you have support, if all it takes is one person to say, that wasn't on you, that wasn't okay, that was abuse, someone helping you naming that, let me make sure you are okay, giving that care.
Externalizing it again.
This is it, exactly. If you internalize it, then that's the risk, because then it touches your sense of who you are, right? So if I tell you, Charlie, just as a basic example, if I tell you, Charlie, you have green hair, like, what is your answer to me?
I'm bored.
But you see what I mean? It's not, you're like, what is she on about? Like it's funny or right.
Yeah. It doesn't affect my self-worth because I can immediately externalize and say, hang on, that's not true.
This is it. Yeah. But if I say something else and it hits, let's say something, and you're like, well, wait a minute, that. And sometimes with trauma, because you go through something that's so painful, your body is in this like state of shock, right? You can't always by yourself. We all need that support of someone saying, hey, I've got you. That wasn't right. This isn't this. Because you're not in a place to even be able to do that, right? Your brain is just like, I'm so unsafe. You need safety to be able to name things and to let things breathe out and to process them. You can't process something if your brain generally believes like, I'm in danger. So if there was something that happened to you and you're in that state and you didn't come back to baseline, or you have no one helping you to come back to baseline, then that's where you stay. So sometimes that's what this is, literally environment and someone to talk to, someone to help you to vocalize this and to not be alone in it.
And we're talking about perception here. I
yes,
think.
A lot
so
of
how we perceive the situation. And from what you're describing there, certainly for a child, the perception concept is made easier if you have someone else who can help you understand and put words to it, and having that kind of emotional literacy to understand and move forwards. But then I guess we move on to adults who maybe are in that post-traumatic world. You know, they've had the trauma and they're living it. Is there a difference there? How do you help someone change their perception? Because at that point they've got this deep-rooted belief. You know, it's changed from an experience and an acute trauma into a deep-rooted belief about who they are. So how does someone change the way they perceive that situation?
I mean, I think it's a beautiful question. It's like, it's the question, right? Like, how do I make that shift? Right? And I would say 50% of that is you. 50% is your own accountability of diving into that trauma. So, you know, building awareness, just also realizing that was traumatic. A lot of people walk around thinking that I had the perfect childhood. But if you deconstruct it, some stuff was not normal, because again, unless someone was there to say that's abusive, No 5-year-old can name that, right? I think that's the norm. So there's an element of a willingness of diving into your own pain, but also being accountable for now having to process it, of having to make sure that this no longer identifies. Like, this is no longer the thing that's gonna be your entire identity. It happened. It's a chapter in the book, but it's not the entire book. And you now need to make a huge amount of effort, and it's painful, but it's necessary to make sure that you live an authentic life. You basically redefine who you are. You get into this exploring journey that is not linear at all. And the other percent is corrective relational experiences. So, if someone had trauma and they felt like they could never lean on anyone, I can never share with anyone, they won't receive that. There's a belief that, well, if I say something to someone, there's no way they're going to be supportive, right? They're going to tell me that I lie or there's no point. So it's having few, step by step, baby steps, but more relationships that allow you to have new experiences where, you know what, I dared to ask for help and they gave it to me.
Yeah.
And so this is why a huge part of trauma work is actually through the relationships of people. I have this with clients sometimes. I'm like, okay, it's time for you to date, generally, because I need you to be now engaging with the outside world to, let's work on the triggers, okay, here's the situation. Usually we'll do X or Y. What about this time we tried to do A and B? How is that going to be like? But there is that, it is needed. If you just do one part, then you still, because your brain needs evidence. It needs to be like, oh, aha, in that moment, it was different than what happened back then. So it helps to contrast.
My version of this, when I'm talking to people with persistent chronic pain, is you need to prove the system wrong.
Yeah, it's exactly that.
That it's overprotecting.
Yes,
that the
beautiful.
protection is unnecessary now.
Exactly.
So you create an error in the system. You do an exercise or a movement that you would originally perceive as unsafe, and you experience that it wasn't painful after all.
Exactly.
And you bring that to your consciousness. You bring it to your present thinking, and the more times you do that, the more evidence your system has that it is, after all, safe to bend in the end. Your back doesn't explode every time you bend and lift up the remote control. So yeah, it sounds like you're saying the same thing, but from a psychological
It's exactly
perspective.
the same principle. And there's an element of also trusting yourself, because as an adult, you're so much more resourceful, right? Like as a kid, you cannot, sometimes it's like, where do I go? If mom and dad doesn't help me, if the teacher doesn't help me, where do I go? But as a grown-up, you have more resources. And even if you don't have them, you can go and you can figure that out. So it's also trusting that if you fall, well, I can get back up again. It doesn't mean it's great, but I do trust that I can be okay. So it becomes like, this doesn't feel okay, but I know I will be. This doesn't feel safe, but I am safe. So it's that nuance. My body thinks it's not safe, but it is. So if right now, let's say I felt very anxious and unsafe, I could tell myself, but I am. I'm sitting here on the couch. You're here with me. We're sitting. We're talking. This is not 20 years ago or something, This is, I'm in the present with you.
Which I love, because I think this is like you're having a conversation with your subconscious.
Basically.
Your subconscious is controlling some physiological response. It's got the breathing up. It's got you feeling tense. You're not choosing that consciously. It's on a subconscious automatic level.
Yeah.
But you can consciously say, I don't necessarily need to feel like that. I know I am, and I'm accepting that. I'm at peace with it. But I am safe after all. Ultimately, my version of that is standing on the stage with a big group of people watching me. I know that is safe, and I know I have the confidence in my ability. I know I have the skill set to deliver.
This is it.
But I feel the emotion. I feel the sensation of people looking at me, watching me, and I get that anxiety build up. In the end, I can normally ease through and figure out a strategy to talk clearly. But it takes a little while for me. But I have to talk to my subconscious in a way.
But that's effort. And this is what I mean. People need to be willing to make that effort, because a lot of people, they underestimate how much that, it takes a lot of energy.
Well, everything in me is telling me, get the fuck off the stage.
This is it, right?
This is awful. But I also know that the value that comes from that is worth it in the end. But another person might choose, that ain't worth it. I'm not going to bother.
Or they will think this is not for me.
Yeah.
So they will never put themselves in situations like this. And that could be like missed opportunities, right? Missed experiences.
The caveat as well is that people can feel so intensely that emotion that they do believe that is just who they are as a person. It's like,
yes,
I have no choice in this. I'm just going to give into it and accept it. And what I guess we're trying to say here is that if you feel it's worth that effort, you may be able to change a big portion of that experience. Maybe not all for some people, but you may be able to change the way you experience that situation, whatever it is, which sounds, I mean, we're rooting it in hope, which is lovely. We've got this real hopeful angle to what we're saying here, which is great. With that person who's coming to you and they want to go through a journey, they want to change who they are. So they've clearly already decided they're ready to change, I guess, by the time they've come to see you. How much work do you do with that person, and how much work is that person doing themselves? Like what kind of journey does it often look like? Because I guess it's the difference between being fixed and learning to sort of fix your problems.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that you always have to cover this expectations, right? People think that I will fix them, and that's not how it works. I'm here to hold your hand as you do the walking, but you're the one doing the walking. And sometimes with trauma, you're going to be feeling like you're walking through fire. That's how painful it can get. But you have to do the walking. So a lot of people, sometimes they come in and they will say that they understand this. And then you start to work on the awareness and we get into the trauma. But then there's a bit of resistance about taking accountability. And I fully understand this because especially in the context of abuse, right? There is an element, it's so painful. It's violation. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of injustice. There's, right, how dare someone do this to me, right? So sometimes when you start to name your trauma, all of the big feelings like this come out, and it's part of it. The issue is if you get stuck in that, so it means if you don't realize that you're the only one who can do your own healing, for lack of a better word, you're stuck in victimization. And this happens often. So I don't mean to speak for other clinicians, but we are used to this, right? People do need space to feel the anger. They do need to finally say, this was not on me, this wasn't okay, this wasn't fair. But if you want to really make sure that trauma no longer has an impact on you in terms of how you identify, right? Your identity and the choices that you make. If you no longer want to, be out in the world and that being your narrative, you need to be the one doing the work fully. And that is difficult because people want to say, but it's not fair. I didn't, because of them, now I'm suffering from X or Y, and now my life looks like this, and I have to do the work. And I hear that, but this is a step. You need to make sure that afterwards, and this is, I always say this, right, to clients. I'm like, someone came into your kitchen and they broke a glass on the floor and they left. So yes, it's not fair. It's not okay. They walked in, no invitation. They broke a glass. It's everywhere. It's messy. It hurts you. You're bleeding. But they left. You're alone in the kitchen now. So now it's down to you to clean that up. And, first thing is to realize that it is there. Second of all, realize that someone comes in and does that. That says more about who they are. It has nothing to do about who you are.
So acceptance.
Exactly.
Externalizing.
Exactly. But then it's about how do I... Because it's harder to put something back into place than to just break it, right? So it's and you have to do that. And so you have options. You can do it by yourself. You can do it with a psychologist. You can ask partners. But people are allowed to say, I don't know how to help you out with this, which is hard for people to hear because people will say, but I have trauma. I went through this. What do you mean you can't, you have to help me? Or, it's almost like it takes away your accountability in the way you show up in relationships. It absolutely does not. You're still accountable for how you treat other people, no matter what your story is, because guess what? They probably have stories as well. Everyone has to make sure that they are as okay as possible so they can show up in their relationships, in the best way possible. And this can be complicated sometimes, to understand that other people can also say, it doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just means they don't have capacity to help you. They don't know. They love you, but they're like, I don't know. And you know what? It's just not for me because I'm too busy with my glass on the floor. So, and this can be difficult, but it is essential, and it's accountability.
Yeah, that word, so simple of a word, so difficult of a concept for someone who's gone through trauma.
So difficult.
To be able to consider that situation, which is clearly so wrong and so much about the other person.
Yeah, exactly.
To be able to then own the responsibility for the healing.
Yeah, it's so hard. It takes a while, honestly. It's so hard. Yeah.
And that's why that metaphor kind of rings true to me there. It's like, well, yeah, you're not going to go through you're not going to call that person up and say, you must come back around again, clean up my, that's not going to create any, that's going to be harder. This
is it. Then a lot of people, even in relationships, if you think about it, a lot of people are I need you to apologize. I'm looking for closure. That person, harm is already done. You cannot undo that. They came in your house, came into your life, did what I had to do, they left. And sometimes that search for you need to acknowledge this for me. And if you don't, then I'm stuck here. That's still giving them power. Whereas reclaiming your power is, okay, this happened. I'm going to make sure that this does no longer define me. But it's down to me. And it's a tricky one because for me, accountability means compassion also. Because compassion is willingness to feel pain. Compassion isn't self-pity. Compassion is, oh my God, this hurts. Let me look at this pain so I can kind of move through it. Okay. It's always through emotions, not around it, through it.
My interpretation around compassion was that you feel the pain, you feel the emotion, and then you act on it. You step back and act upon it.
Yeah.
Whereas empathy is very much feeling it and being in it. So it's that ability to step back and act, which I love that use from a psychological perspective as well. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, compassion is kind of it's the key that you need to get through the door of accountability.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Yes. And this is why people talk about having self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
You need to accept and feel the emotion and then have a plan towards recovery or acting upon that in a structured way. Yeah,
and also it's for some people the starting line is even the compassion of I deserve healing. I deserve a different story. And
the way you're saying that is, I imagine, is because you get some situations where people don't feel they deserve. Is that right?
They don't. No. There's an underlying belief of well, this is my life. Yeah. If you've never felt acceptance from other people, even building that for yourself is what are you talking about? Self-acceptance, self-compassion. And people with a lot of trauma, they are very resistant to compassion, actually, because it's so uncomfortable. It's I don't know what this is. So people who have never really been hugged, let's take that as an example, right? Then when people are hugging you as an adult, you're what? Get off me. So it's I want the closeness. I want the intimacy. But I'm so scared of it because my body interprets that as danger still. So you want the closeness, but you're also super scared of it. So you then isolate, but you're also not okay when you're isolating so you're constantly just so sad. It's really, really sad.
So it's back to that conscious desire for closeness, but that automatic process of detesting it and that rejection from it, wanting to run away from it.
Yeah. And that, if you think about it, that's a beautiful metaphor for that's disconnection.
You in particular keep talking about pain and discomfort and suffering. These sound like very physical, body related things.
Yes.
Why does it hurt? Why does the psychology and the psychological trauma and the emotional pain, why is that painful? Why do we think that is?
Interesting. Well, pain for me, it's always from a protective point of view first, at least in the context of trauma. Because if I think about just kind of symptoms, if I think about it clinically for a minute, people come with things like sleep problems or chest pain or back pain or, very severe anxiety. So, such hypervigilance that it just feels like the whole body is constantly in pain, really. That first, I always, explain that it's there for a reason. Pain wants to be listened to.
So it's one of many, by the sounds of it. It's one of many different responses that the system might use. So we talk about pain as the center point, but actually it almost seems like an umbrella term for various different manifestations within the body.
Absolutely. So for me, it's literally like physiological sensations. And it's the way that I understand it is that pain is there to tell you something. But what we do is, oh my God, I don't want to feel this constantly. And we live in a world that promotes that, right? So numb the whole time. You can also see it in like simple conversations. I had a bad day. Oh, let's go have a drink. Let's have pizza. Let's go watch everything that has to do with distract. And I'm not saying never do that, right? But if you never take time and space to kind of sit with yourself, what is this about, right? Instead of constantly thinking, what is the next pill that I can take, right? Then you're missing out on trying to understand what it is. And you know what? It's going to get louder. Okay, I always see this as a little child who is asking an adult, like, hello, I'm hungry. And then you have two choices. So you either have the adult who answers, okay, that's great, I will make you a snack, but you know what? It's going to take 20 minutes. You think you can wait 20 minutes? And the child would be like, sure, fine. So because they have that reassurance, they can continue to play, and they can tolerate the feeling of hunger more because it was acknowledged and food is on the way. So I'm safe, right? My survival is completely fine. I'll be okay. But if the adult is just like, yeah, well, give me a minute, not right now, and it's just not acknowledging the child for some reason, this is when you get built up frustration. This is when it starts to scream, the tantrum, the tears, and it's because you're not listening. So it's the same thing with pain. Pain wants you to listen. Any kind of tension deserves attention. And once you understand what that pain wants from you, so generally just ask it, what if that pain had a voice, what would it say? And it's amazing the things that could come out from that question. It feels strange at first because you've never really done that exercise, but make this a habit. Ask your body, like, what is this about? What do you need? Same thing with emotions. They're there to tell you something. Anger is there was a violation. Sadness usually has to do with like loss, right? Anxiety, safety. I'm not feeling safe. So it's about understanding the cues of your body, what they're trying to tell you, but you need to have space to listen. And we don't make space for that anymore. That's the problem. So you're constantly disconnected. So it gets louder. And this is when then people end up with things like chronic pain issue, or the pain is so severe, then it has an impact on your functioning. So now I can't go to work like I was before, or, something is kind of having an impact just enough on your day to day that it forces you to see like a doctor. Usually that's how it happens.
What will that doctor do? That doctor will give you some form of medication to numb the pain.
Well, yes, unless that doctor has some training, on a psychological level, or it can happen that maybe I cannot speak for GPs, but I know that GPs do know if a person keeps coming back, right? And it's always the same situation, that it could be that it's, a bit psychological. But yes, you're right. I can see what you mean. Often then the process is, here are some kind of painkillers, or let's make sure it's nothing physical. Then you realize it's not physical, but then you kind of leave it. It's not addressed, right? Yeah.
What are the manifestations of some of these? You mentioned there a little bit around anger leads to this, and sadness is sometimes this. What other patterns do you tend to see with unresolved trauma that some people might be able to help join some dots?
The first thing that comes to mind, honestly, is burnout. Because, burnout is denial 101. No one just burns out. If you look at the history of someone who comes through the door with, like, I'm burning out, like, I'm really not okay, it's been happening for a long time, at least 6 months, a year. And with burnout is that you sense that your body is too stressed. You sense that something's off. But you just don't listen to it. You put it on the side, right? There's, I can just deal with it. Oh, it's just a bit of stress. And this, people with trauma can be really good at that, because you know what? They're so good at surviving. You can give it, I mean, they have the skills to survive. It's incredible how far your body can go, right? So there is, in your mind, you kind of forget that it's not because you can take so much on your shoulders that you should. But people think, well, the more I can take on, the more praise that I get. Look, I'm doing a million things. I'm like seen as like the person who's like multitasking the whole time, and like, you know, badass woman doing so much, and badass successful guy doing this. And so you get that kind of praise around that. But actually, within, you're not doing okay. And sometimes you're so busy with doing that you don't even hear it anymore. But actually, when you have a conversation with your doctor and you're like, wait, when did that start? And you start to do the timeline, you realize, oh my God, it's been there for a while. And you realize how disconnected you've been with yourself. So trauma and burnout, huge overlap, even in terms of like the symptoms, sort of fogginess, sometimes feeling like you're kind of floating around, just always on this adrenaline high, feeling so uncomfortable the second that you stop. Yeah.
Why can some people tolerate huge workloads and seemingly stay energized throughout, and other people don't tolerate relatively low workloads?
I mean, when you're used to so much adrenaline from surviving, it's just your norm. The problem is one day it's just not going to be there anymore, right? So that's what this is. It's also conditioning. One of the reasons is conditioning. The other one is that, you know, is it even a good thing? So I know it's portrayed as like, I can take on so much more than you, but are you sure? That if you really sit down and have that conversation, are you sure that because people will say this, but if you actually pause and you look at their lives and everything around that, there's an imbalance. Something's not quite right.
How do you help people through that? How do you inquire in that moment? Because it sounds, again, sort of disconnection. So
yes,
with self, disconnection with self. So what kind of things might you help someone understand, guide people towards in order to figure out who they want to be?
I think one of the questions as well is that if we're tapping into conversations like this, is, you know, what are you afraid to lose? That's a big one. Because if you change the way you're operating, so if you're on this big high, okay, the whole time, this big high is serving your purpose, right? You're used to it. So if suddenly we're no longer on an adrenaline high, it means the way that other people will perceive me is going to be different. I'm no longer be this person who's doing everything. I'm now doing less. Okay, what does that mean for my sense of attachment? For some people, there's an element of fear of losing that. People will now see me in a different way, and maybe they won't like me anymore. I'm not going to be good enough. I don't belong in this environment anymore. I'm going to lose my job. Things like that. So then if I change, who do I become? And what part of me am I letting go? And this is often what's underneath trauma and burnout.
So what is your true sense of self, rather than what is your occupation? Who are you?
Yeah. Exactly. So you're slowly building up to that question. And it happens very often for me to hear, I don't know who I am. So they come in and talk about their relationships, and I'm so angry. What about this? What about that? You know, everything about the outside world. And slowly through conversation. But this is why I'm not giving you a clear answer on like the how do you poke, because it depends. It depends on the person, and depends where I'm at with them. Also, if I sense that you're not ready to go there, I'm not really going there. But I might point out that there's a bit of resistance. What is that about? So to help them realize that there's something about them that's like, I'm not ready to let go. I'm here. Because if they come here, there is an element of them willing, obviously, to be part of the process. But sometimes it happens that you're in this in-between. Like, I want to, but the part of their body that's not ready to go there, I'm still protecting so much. Like, absolutely not. So there's blockage. So I have to, obviously, I call it working with resistance. Instead of like, oh, you're not ready to go there, never mind, therapy isn't for you. I work with it. So it's like, okay, what is that resistance about? What are you afraid of? If that resistance could speak, you know. And also, what does that resistant need to feel safe? So we're kind of, how can we be less guarded? But this is a process. It's really not easy. It's not something that you just start with, right?
So there's a link from what you're describing with historical trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like there could also be an independent link to not knowing who you are.
Yes, really.
And society in general seems to be very good at labeling people, giving people attachments and associations with Charlie the physio. You know that, for example. You know, like
true, yeah.
So then, what's healthy and what's unhealthy? Because you know, I'm proud to be a physio, proud to be a dad, proud to be a husband. You know, I have these levels of pride. And is pride even a good thing? You know, is that a positive thing? You know, there's some negative connotations with pride. Is that covering up something else? So I've just given you 3 or 4 different questions all in one.
No, it's great.
But the labeling is interesting to me there. Like, how do we unpick that about what could be missing in someone's life versus maybe where there's too much of something in someone's life?
For me, it's about balance. That's what this is. So if I ask you, Charlie, name me 5 things that you love about yourself. I mean, you don't need to do it, but if, let's say, I ask you this and you start to answer like, I love that I'm a physio, and I'm like, why? It's like, because I love to help people. Okay. Then I ask you, and then you tell me I love because I'm a father. Okay. But then you look at me and you're like, and we have 3 more left, okay? And in the 2 things that you told me, they're both beautiful, okay? I'm also in the helping industry, so I totally, right?
Yeah.
But if your entire identity is how much you give out to other people, and what are you getting, right? What are you giving you, and what are you getting from others? Because even being a parent, okay, you're giving out, right? So it's beautiful. But it's also exhausting. It's also, right? It's totally, a lot of parents feel like it's uncomfortable to name that, but I've heard it at many. Hard. Exactly. It's hard. Really hard, you know? So I would say, okay, well, there's something missing. And it's also up for you to tell me if you feel like something is not okay. Most of the time, if you're here, something's already off. But if you're just walking around and I meet you at a bar and you're like, I like this and this and this about who I am, who am I to tell you who you should be, right? So you decide that for yourself. But for me, clinically, when I'm in the room with a client and something's off anyways, but they're not really naming it and it's difficult to start to have the big conversations, I try to get a sense of where is that sense of me coming from? Where are you getting it? And if it's just from the outside world, that means you're more than just caring for other people. If I take that out and take the role of the father out, who are you? If we take this out, what's left? Who else?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
You're asking a really interesting question about something that I've been figuring out myself recently, which is that around 6 years ago, I stopped playing structured sport. I realized that rugby no longer fit in my life. I'd also had a realization that actually I wasn't really getting that much better in it, and I really like to improve in stuff. So it was a mutual decision for me internally, alongside necessity, having a young family, but also a lack of passion for the process. So I fairly happily stepped away from playing rugby. But recently I've started to get this urge for sport. And it isn't rugby, actually. Because if you say, like, who am I? Sport is a huge part of who I am. I love watching. I love playing. I don't even care which sport it is. I just want to play sports. Yeah. And I run, and that's fun. But it doesn't give me the same enjoyment as team sport, some kind of skill-based sport. And I've been thinking recently, like, I think I might be craving it. You know, there's this bit where my kids are a little bit older. Yeah. Maybe there's a bit of extra space back in my life, and it's definitely a big part of who I would say I am. Yeah. And it's not in my life. I've played a little bit of sport occasionally in the last few months, and every time I play it, I'm like, oh, I love it. That gives me a lot of joy. So yeah, it's a process that I'm sort of working on now, but it does require balance, because
Exactly.
I still have a wife. I still have 2 children. I still have a business that I'm running. Where do I fit that? So
Exactly. And sometimes, and they're big things. It's not easy to balance this out.
Yeah.
So again, it's so easy to get kind of lost into like, I need to secure this. It's like, okay, but securing that without you being well, or at least well enough, then the decisions that you're going to make about everything here are not going to be sustainable in the long term because they're not authentic. This is going to crumble at some point. And then what do you have left? Then that's really painful. So it's hard. And it's also, you know what? It's realizing that this fluctuates. I really like this, what you're bringing, that sometimes, you realize something isn't for you, but it's just because, rugby is still sports, right? So that wasn't for you. And maybe the timing for that was not right. But now you have a bit more space and I can engage with sports in a different way. And this is also important to acknowledge. People's needs fluctuates. You can't also do everything at once also, right? Like timing.
I've been saying this to people recently. You can only have so many priorities.
Exactly. But you need to make sure you're the one setting them. If it's coming from a different place, that's when you get problems because, again, you go back to disconnection. And a lot of people are so afraid of making choices like this because, it means you're selfish, it means you're this. And if you have trauma, it's even harder because you haven't really been encouraged to be the one who's driving the front seat, right?
And one of the things that I've realized as well is that if I want to bring more into my life, I can't just add more days to the week or hours to the day.
Yes, exactly.
I then have to sacrifice something, and I have to be careful about what that sacrifice is.
Yes.
Because does that then take away from other things that are very essential within my life that create this overall sense of balance? So just adding more is not necessarily going to make sense.
But this is really good that you're bringing this because this is, kind of the dilemma, almost like how do you make decisions? And I always like to say, well, the one that you can emotionally tolerate, there's always a downside to something, right? So you need to just make sure that you're very okay with that. If I do this and the potential consequences, I don't know, less time with X or Y, I have fully accepted it. So then when the consequence comes through the door, I'm not surprised and I'm okay with it. It's still uncomfortable. You can still be like, I wish, you can still have some feelings about it, but there's an element of acceptance. When you're not okay with things, then resentment can knock on your door, and that's very different. So this is why it's so important to make choices that fit with who you are. You're making the decisions. This works. Because if you're making them for someone else, that's also problematic.
So the controlling element, potentially, that you're controlling someone else's choices or trying to control someone else. I guess that could even be part of a loss in yourself, is trying to control.
This is it. And this in relationships is hard because it's a continuous kind of negotiation, especially when you have a family, right? So it's hard, but you have to make sure that if this is going to cost a little bit of me, am I okay with that? Is the amount that I have left is not enough for me? Can I be really honest about that? If it is, fine. If not, then we need to consider other things, and that's usually scary. So people don't really go near that, and they're like, yeah, sure, I'm fine with it. But at 6 months later, not really, or the body starts to act out. You start to get random rash, headaches, whatnot. Yeah.
Which is what you mean by resentment.
Well, this is going to happen sometimes when you feel like you're making decisions, especially in relationships. It's like, okay, I'm going to do less of this so you have more room to do that. Okay. But if you're not okay, actually deep down with doing less of whatever you gave up,
This is the truth of my situation right now. It's like I work late 2 nights a week. My wife will probably work late once or twice a week. So then I say, oh, by the way, that weekday evening we have together? I'm going to go and play football with my friends. It's like, well, hang on a minute. There's 2 people in this decision that have to be respected. So it's complicated. It's
it is really because you're trying to balance out the needs of the relationship and your own needs I need my me time.
Yeah.
So this is why it's so important to not rush decisions, have conversations. And knowing what it is that you can tolerate, knowing how much you can balance out from one another. Relationships are never 50-50, by the way. This idea, no. You're
it's also
responsible
50-50 within which part
No,
of the
but this is
relationship.
it.
You know, it's like within that
Exactly.
part it's that, within that part it's that.
It's not.
I get
It
what
doesn't
you're
work like that. It's almost like too neat for it to be true, right?
Yeah.
So ideally, you take care of yourself and you know yourself enough, right? So when you can continue to pour a little bit extra when the other one is a little bit down, and you take turns. That's family. You take turns. Looking for that perfect balance, it's not there.
As we start to wrap up the episode, it'd be great if you could recommend some resources for our listeners to access based on some of the conversation we've had today.
Yes.
What kind of things or people, whatever it might be, would you recommend people look at to learn more about the subject?
I mean, I really highly recommend people to read. Okay, so first one is 100% Dr. Gabor Mate, because the writing is so clear. There's a lot of stuff online as well. So that's definitely him.
He's wonderful.
Peter Levine as well. He also has, I can't remember the name of the book, but it's a little book that talks specifically about boundaries with your body. So that's amazing for people who have like history of trauma and they are re-exploring their sense of safety. So what I was talking about, and just like trying to test out what are my boundaries with my body, and realizing that your body does it knows when it's too far. It knows, it's like with water. Like if you're under shower, you're playing with the water against your palm, like it gets kind of warmer, right? At what point is your body being like, no, I don't like that, right? And it wants distance. So it's really good for reconnecting with your body in a way, in a very safe way. And then I also think that for some people, Terry Real would be great as well, because he talks about healing in a relational way. Carol Gilligan, also brilliant. There's so much work. I mean,
Well, I'd add in
things.
the James Hollis podcast
Yes.
episode that I mentioned with Andrew Huberman, the Huberman Lab podcast, which was fantastic. It's a podcast I'll probably listen to again, which I don't think I've ever said. So so that's one I would add to the conversation.
There are a lot, but this is it. I would highly recommend for people to read.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know it's so much easier to get things on, online on social media, but there are so many books out there.
Sure.
It's just, please take the time to read them and go slowly over them. And if you are in therapy and you read books, oh my God, bring that in. I do this with my clients. I also suggest, book recommendations, podcasts, or if I hear something and I'm like, ooh, that will help with that, bring it in. So if you're reading something and you're in therapy, oh my God, please do that, right? Like, if you see something on social media and you're like, this is really destabilizing, or it goes against everything we talked about yesterday in my session, please mention that, because we have to work with this as well.
It's
right?
a process.
Yes, exactly. It's all process.
What have we not spoken about today that we should have spoken about? Anything you can think of that we've not covered in the conversation?
I mean, it's such a this is so broad that we could easily do a second episode, right? For sure. I think we could talk a lot more about relational patterns, actually, in a more specific way in terms of attachments. But, even in terms of the process of the actual change. So the grief that comes with that is not something that we've talked a lot about. So the relationships that change, and how to also build certain kind of skills to deal when you are in that space of loss. Because when you're stepping out of dysfunction, everything that was going with that is going to go. So certain relationships we're going to say goodbye to, we might, decide to be in different environments. And that is very unsettling. And it's a very big part of the process, though. So we could talk about that another time. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think even just raising it, the word grief, putting the word grief on this is important.
Absolutely. Yeah. You have to see this as you're also grieving a part of you that's been protecting you for so long. That is also important to name. It's that survival, because we see it so much as like, oh my God, I have to heal, I have to get better. And you know what? I do get it. For some people, it's like, oh my God, like I'm going insane. Like that is how in so much pain they are in. But once you realize, okay, like this was still coming from such a beautiful place from me within, though, right? Like, and I'm still here. So like, thank you for making sure that I'm still here. But I just no longer need you right now, right? I'm safe. But even saying goodbye to that's beautiful grief, but it is still grief. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to your answer on this final question. What does better never ends mean to you?
For me, see, flow comes up. Flow, fluidity. Yeah, it's just you're riding waves. And that's the goal. You're just riding waves, and you're just trying to show up for yourself every day, for your physical health and your mental health and your family, your community, and yourself.
I knew you wouldn't let me down. Lovely answer. And just finally, how would someone find out a bit more about you if they want to reach out?
Oh, online, you just Google my name. You can find my website. It's pretty straightforward. I'm also on like counseling directory listings, or also Psychology Today. Yeah, it's pretty easy to find me.
Your handles on Instagram or other?
Yes. So my Instagram is Reflect with Dr. Pauline. Just super easy to find. And yeah, I will give you anyway, so you can.
We'll put it in.
Yeah, we'll put it in. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for today. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Better, provider of health, wellness and performance services based in central London. You can book in for face-to-face services at either of our 2 clinics, one in Soho and one in the city. You can also follow us on Instagram at Better Never Ends, or head over to our website for more information about the clinics or the podcast at www.betterneverends.com. And of course, if you want to send us an email with any feedback, questions or suggestions for future episodes, then email us on podcast@betterneverends.com. And finally, thanks to Brian Long for editing the show. Without him, it's absolutely no doubt in my mind that these would never have seen the light of day. And it will allow this podcast to continue on for as long as I'll keep recording them. So thanks very much, Brian.